Well, hey, good morning, everybody.
Good morning, John.
I don't know how it sounds out there, but like at the end of that bass when you're standing right here, like I felt like I should be raising from the floor. Like it just was. Anyways, my name's John. I'm one of the pastors here, and so good to see you today. If you're returning from spring break and you went someplace warm, or maybe you're watching online from someplace warm right now, just a reminder from those of us who didn't go someplace warm, we don't want to hear about it. It's been really cold, and so we're proud of our pastiness, and we're good with that. Anyways, it's hard to believe that Easter is right around the corner. I don't know about you, but because Easter's early this year, it just feels like it crept up on us. Now, for those of us that work at the church, Easter is one of our busiest times. This next week is one of our busiest seasons, but it's also one of our favorite seasons because we get to, through this next week, remember the incredible sacrifice that Jesus made for us. And then next Sunday, Easter Sunday, let's face it, it's just a giant party, right? Next Sunday is a celebration of our risen Lord. In fact, when I was growing up and little and in church, every single Easter Sunday, it started out with the same phrase. And if you grew up in church, you might have heard this phrase before, but it starts out this way. It starts out, "He is risen," and then it ends. "He is risen indeed." Yeah, that wasn't great. So let's try that one more time. "He is risen." That's right. And so that's what we celebrate next Sunday. We hope that you join us for that as we celebrate our risen Savior. But it's hard to sometimes remember and grapple with the fact that before Jesus appeared to Mary in the garden, right, and before a few disciples ran as fast as they could and discovered the empty tomb, that those few days before Easter Sunday, that celebration over 2,000 years ago, they were much, much different, right? I don't know about you. I've never been to a church before where the few days before Easter you came in and someone said to you, "He is dead." And you said back, "He's dead indeed." And that phrase may disturb some of you, right? That's a little unsettling. It may even feel sacrilegious for me to say that. But as much as death is unsettling and disturbing, the reality is that the empty tomb would have been meaningless if it weren't for what came before that, right? The empty tomb wouldn't give us hope unless he had died on the cross before that. And so in this series, as we've been looking at this mystery on Skull Mountain and unraveling the facts of something that happened over 2,000 years ago, looking at eyewitness accounts that we still have on that event, for us first to get to the hope that we have in a risen Savior, we must first wade through the tragedy. And in order for us to embrace the life that we can have in Jesus, then we first need to embrace the death. Now, death is an interesting subject in our world today. Some of you today, as soon as I put that up there, you just felt weird on the inside. You don't like to talk about death. You don't want to think about death. You think if you ignore it, it'll go away. It won't, by the way. Then there's also a weird fascination in our society with death by some people. I mean, this whole rise of true crime podcasts or television shows, death dominates our headlines. For some of you here today, death pulls at your heartstrings in a way you didn't imagine or think it would. I think of the recent loss and tragedy of Carson Hughes in our community and watching our community respond to that. Many of you respond to that even if you didn't know him. But the one thing that none of us really like to talk about is our own death, right? None of us want to imagine how we're going to die or when we're going to die or the impact it'll have on others. In fact, just me having the word death up here and saying death so many times this morning has you uncomfortable. You would wish I'd talk about anything else. You're praying that the pastor will change the sermon to be about sex or money. Something you'd rather deal with those than with death, which is saying something. But if it makes you feel more comfortable this morning, we actually are not going to talk directly about death today. In fact, we're not even going to look at that part of the story of Jesus. But there's an interesting intersection between the narrative that leads up to the cross, what happened before that death, and something that impacts our lives and something for us to think about this morning. And that's this question: what will we be remembered for? Right? So when you're dead and gone and your time has ended on this earth, what will you be remembered for? Now, fun fact, I'm not scared of death. Death doesn't freak me out at all. When I was a little kid, we had a couple of really tough losses in my family. We lost my grandpa to cancer and my older brother Mike to a car accident. And so in my family, death was just a topic of discussion like any other topic. So for me, death is just another part of life. It's inevitable. And if you ask Melissa or ask any of my daughters, they will tell you they already know what I want at my funeral because I am okay with talking about it. I don't want an open casket because I think people looking at my dead body is a little creepy. So I'd prefer to be cremated. I don't know if you find this sacrilegious at all. I want a Pink Floyd song at my funeral. Wish You Were Here is one of my favorite songs of all times, and so I want that played at my funeral. But then maybe the oddest request that I've been very specific about is that I want some pictures of me blown up real big and put on easels and placed around at my funeral so people see them when they come in. And I don't want them to be pictures of me growing up or pictures of me with my family even. I kind of want them to be pictures like this one. That's disturbing. I know that's a disturbing picture. Maybe one of my favorite ones is this next one. This is definitely one I want to have up. Now, just for sake of time and to keep you curious, I'm not explaining any of those to you. You'll just have to imagine. But if you know me at all, then you also know that a big part of me is I'm a gigantic goofball. I just am. And so I love to make people laugh. I love to make people smile. I love to laugh. And so in death, that's kind of what I want to be remembered for. I want my friends and my family who come into my funeral expecting something serious to see that and go, what the heck, and laugh. I just want to make them smile and hopefully remember all the times that I've made them smile before. And so that may be what I'm hoping to be remembered for, but what about you? What will you be remembered for? Or maybe the better question for each of us isn't what we'll be remembered for, but what we want to be remembered for. And so that's the question that I want us to sit with this morning. All right, as we look at this next part of the mystery of Skull Mountain, I want us to sit with this question of what do we want to be remembered for? And even if you think you got it figured out, like me, right? Even if you think you got all that figured out, I want you to just let God speak into you today. As we look at one major character in the mystery. In fact, whether you grew up in church or not, or no matter where you are in faith, my guess is you've heard of this person before because they're famous. Well, they're at least infamous. This morning, we're going to talk about a guy named Pontius Pilate. Now, little history, Pontius Pilate was the 5th governor of the province of Judea. You see, by the time of Jesus, the nation of Israel, the land that we consider Israel, it had been conquered and reconquered and conquered and reconquered. And by the time Rome came, they divided Israel up into 5 provinces. And so Pilate was the governor of one of those provinces, Judea. Now, it sounds like governor of Judea would be a pretty important job, but it actually was a fairly lower level post in the Roman government. You see, being governor over a Jewish province, it presented some risk. If you were governor of any Roman province, you basically had 2 main jobs. Here's your 2 jobs. One is to keep the peace, Pax Romana, no rebellions, no uprisings. You wanted to keep the peace. Everything's easy peasy. The second thing you wanted to do, a governor of an area, was to just keep the resources coming in, keep the taxes flowing to Rome to support Rome. So Pilate had 2 main jobs, keep the peace, keep the taxes coming in. And when you had a Jewish province, well, that was a little dicey because the Jews were a peculiar people. You see, the Jews had a religion that was considered by the Roman Empire to be one of the oldest, if not the oldest religion. And therefore, it came with a certain amount of respect for Rome. So the Jews were allowed to observe their religious laws and customs. So when you governed a province, you had to do this careful dance between their religious laws and customs and the laws of Rome. And that could be difficult at times. On top of that, in addition to the religious laws and customs, the Jews believed that God had divinely given them this land. And therefore, they loathed anybody that occupied their land. In fact, throughout history, the Jews were known to revolt and rebel. So Pilate would have had his hands full. Pilate knew that there was a lot riding on how he governed this land. And interestingly enough, we don't know a whole lot from history about Pilate himself. The books we have in the Bible, the 4 biographies of Jesus' life, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, that probably tells us the most about Pilate than any other place. So we don't know how he grew up. We don't know his family. We don't know how he got to be governor of Judea. We do know through outside biblical sources that he had some run-ins with the Jews early in his ruling, and that kind of had him on the edge. Pilate wasn't a secure governor of the province. But other than that, we don't know a ton. So we're going to look this morning at Pilate's role in the mystery at Skull Mountain. We're going to look at the book of John, the biography that John wrote on Jesus' life. So if you have your Bible with you, we'll be in John chapter 18. You could turn there with us, or I'll have it up on the screen so everybody can follow along. But let's go ahead and read where John starts here and Pilate enters the story. So in our story, it says, "Then the Jewish leaders, they took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor," that's again Pilate, "and by now it was early morning." So if you remember last week where we left the story, Jesus was with his disciples after the Last Supper, and they were in the Garden of Gethsemane praying. And it was after at the Garden of Gethsemane that Jesus was arrested, right? The temple guard, the Jewish police, for lack of a better term, came and arrested him after he was betrayed by Judas, one of his own. And so that evening, at night, Jesus had been taken to the home of Caiaphas, the high priest. And there at Caiaphas' home, the Sanhedrin was assembled. Now, Sanhedrin is just a big word for the Jewish ruling body. Kind of think of it like our Supreme Court and our Senate kind of all in one. That was the Sanhedrin. And they put Jesus on trial in Caiaphas' home that night. Now, if you haven't guessed it already, there's a lot that's super suspect about this, right? Or as my daughter would say, it's super sus, right? This is sus. If you're a millennial, this is sus. Here's why. First of all, when they arrested Jesus, they arrested him at night. And instead of taking him to a place where the Sanhedrin normally met, outside the temple, they took him to Caiaphas' personal home. That was super unusual. Second, as we've talked about, all of this happened at night, so nobody would know about it. Nobody would know that they were putting Jesus on trial. And in fact, the Gospels tell us that while Jesus was on trial, they actually slapped him and hit him, which isn't really proper behavior of a key witness that you're accusing. And so it becomes morning now, and they've had their trial, and John tells us that they took Jesus from Caiaphas' house, and now they go to Pilate's house. And I'm sure Pilate was having coffee, having a nice morning, and then they all show up with Jesus. Here's Pilate's, real quick, one last thing. These people must have thought there's some rules you should follow and some you shouldn't follow, because they could have a secret trial and they could accuse Jesus with false witnesses and they could hit him. But as John would tell us in the next verse, go ahead and let's go on to the next verse, that to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, they didn't enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. See, Pilate was not Jewish. He was considered a Gentile. So if they went into his home, they were considered unclean. And then they couldn't participate in the Passover. Which is kind of ironic, right? That you could have a secret trial and accuse someone of false things and hit them, and that's okay. But they didn't want to be unclean. And so Pilate then comes out, and he wants to see what's going on. Here's what John tells us. Pilate came out to them and asked, "What are the charges you're bringing against this man?" Basically, why have you interrupted my morning? Why is he here? Their response is, if he were not a criminal, right? If Jesus wasn't a criminal, we wouldn't have handed him over to you, Pilate. All right, Pilate, what? I don't really know why you care what the charges are, because we already know what the verdict is. See, in their eyes and in their mind, Jesus was already guilty of what they accused him of. Now, Luke tells us that they were accusing Jesus of 2 specific things. 1, opposing paying taxes to the Roman government. 2, claiming to be a king. So if you ever thought that these guys were complete idiots, pay attention to this, because this was a brilliant move on their part. Remember, what are the main things Pilate needs to do? Keep the peace, collect the money. Keep the peace, collect the money. Money and power, money and power. So what do they accuse Jesus of? Not wanting to keep the peace by claiming to be a king and opposing taxes, and that's the money and the power. They knew where Pilate's pressure points were. So that's what they accused him of. And so Pilate, after they tell him what he's accused of, Pilate goes on and says, well, fine, why don't you just take Jesus, you judge him by your own laws. But then they make it clear that they're not here to have a trial, right? We have no right to execute anyone. I mean, they're not here for justice. They're not here for a verdict. They're here for blood. That's why they came to Pilate. And so Pilate knows he's not going to get anywhere with this angry mob and trying to question Jesus in front of them, right? So he takes a page out of their book. He's going to do this in private. He goes into his home. He knows they're not going to come in because they don't want to be unclean. And then he summons Jesus to them, and then he questions them. Here's what John tells us. He brought Jesus to him, and then the only question he asks him is, are you king of the Jews? Right? Clearly, Pilate wasn't fazed by the idea of one Jewish man being opposed to paying taxes. That didn't bother him. But someone that could disrupt the peace, that was threatening to Pilate. Having some messianic wannabe who's going to lead an uprising, that was a threat. In fact, in the 30 to 40 years before Pilate was governor of Judea, there were several high-profile figures who claimed to be the Messiah and led revolts against the occupying forces. Pilate knew this. He needed to keep the peace. His governorship couldn't last another uprising. So all he cares about is, Jesus, are you king? Now here's Jesus' response to that. He says, Pilate, is that your own idea? Or did others talk to you about me? Are you saying that I'm a king? Do you think I'm a king? Or is that just what other people are telling you I am? Now, just on a personal side note, one of the things I love most about Jesus during his 3-year public ministry is he never played the power card on anybody, right? He never forced anybody to believe in him or follow him. He invited them to think for themselves. He gave them an invitation to something better, but he never played the power card, and he wasn't going to play it here. Now, when we read Pilate's response, you may think Pilate's being a little snarky here, but he's not. He's making a point to Jesus. Pilate responds to Jesus, and he says, am I a Jew, Jesus? Right? Do I understand your laws and customs? Do I get your Jewish scriptures and your prophecy and all the things that you Jews are talking about? I don't, right? I don't get it because I'm not Jewish. But here's what I do know. I do know that your own people, the Jews, and the chief priests, who are the bigwigs of your own people, they've handed you over to me. So clearly, you've done something. Why don't you just tell me what you've done and let's get this over with? But Jesus, as he responds to Pilate here, he actually doesn't respond to this new direct line of questioning. In fact, he goes back. He goes back to this whole notion of Pilate asking him if he's a king. And look how Jesus starts his response in the next verse. Jesus says, my kingdom. And I want to pause there for a second, because if you're like me, you might think, well, wait a minute, just a few verses back, it felt like he was dodging the question if he was a king. But now he's talking about his kingdom. What's up? Well, I feel sometimes our English language, it trips us up. Because I don't know about you, but when I think the word kingdom, here's immediately what my brain sees. I see a little castle with a fort and a turret, and I imagine a little village with villagers inside. That's a kingdom. So I picture a land, a castle. But the Greek word that Jesus used here, it wasn't a kingdom or a castle. It's really more like his kingship or his authority, where he gets his ability to rule from, his sovereignty. And so Jesus goes on in this verse and he says, my kingdom, so Pilate, my ability to rule, my authority, it's not from this world. It's not based on a province or a place or a people. Because if it were, right, if I was really after something, if I wanted to take power away from people, well, then my servants, well, they would have fought to prevent my arrest. I wouldn't have come willingly, Pilate. But now, my kingdom, my authority, it's from another place. And if you thought Pilate was smart, well, he's really not, because he's not tracking with Jesus here, and he thinks he's got him. So Pilate's response to all this is just, aha, gotcha, you're a king, right? You're a king, Jesus, you just said it, you've got a kingdom. But look at Jesus' response. It's such a great response. We're going to camp out here for a couple minutes. Jesus responds back and says, you say that I'm a king, Pilate. I mean, right now you're putting words in my mouth and saying I'm a king. But in fact, the reality is, the reason I was born, the reason I came into this world is to testify to the truth. And everyone on the side of truth, well, they listen to me. Now, I don't know about you, I feel like this first part of the verse is pretty easy to understand because as you read Jesus' teaching and look at his life, the truth he came to testify, I think it's pretty clear, right? That there is a God who created us, a God who has a way he wants us to live life, and he wants us to have a relationship with him. That's the truth that Jesus modeled and spoke about. But I wrestled with this last part of the verse. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. What did he mean by that? In fact, I was tempted as I wrote this sermon just to skip that part of the verse, and I knew you wouldn't catch on, so we wouldn't have to cover it. But something kept, just drawing me back to it. And so I poured through a lot of commentaries. I honestly struggled because I didn't feel like they were capturing the tone and just how Jesus was going through this time, how he spoke at the Last Supper and from here on out. And so this is my humble attempt at trying to explain what I think Jesus means by all this. You see, I think when Jesus came, he didn't just testify a one-sided truth. That's not what he modeled. It's not just like, hey, I'm God, this is how you live, and you need to believe and follow me. I think that Jesus, when he spoke the truth, he spoke into this amazing way that God created us, this fingerprint that I think God created us with in our lives, where each of us have this insatiable desire to find something out of this world that we can't find in the world. To fill an empty spot in our heart. Sometimes we call that a God-shaped hole in our hearts that he created us with, and we try to cram stuff in it like money and things and success and power, relationships. But the reality is all that's empty. And the only thing that can permanently and completely fill that hole in our lives is Jesus. And so when you look at Jesus' ministry, right, he would go to people who were nothing like him. And the Bible told us people that weren't like him at all liked him. And Jesus could speak into them. He could relate to them in ways that nobody had seen before. And I think those people, right, that listened to Jesus, that were drawn to his teaching and said, there's something there. That's what I think he means here. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. That everybody who recognizes that insatiable desire and truly investigates it, right, is open to listening and learning and thinking. That when they met Jesus, or today when they hear Jesus' teaching, they're like, bam, that's what I've been missing. That's going to fill that place in my life that haven't been able to fill with anything else. I mean, it's kind of like that cliche phrase that sometimes I think we take for granted when someone comes after leading a tough life and they say, now that I've found Jesus, because truly they've been searching their whole lives for something they couldn't find, and now I found it. It's Jesus. But not everybody wants to find the truth. The reality is not everybody wants to find something that's absolutely right or absolutely wrong. And Pilate was one of them. Look at Pilate's really wise response to Jesus here. He says, what is truth? I mean, you almost can see him like Shakespeare. Like, what is truth? So deep. Pilate had a hard time believing there could be anything that's an absolute truth. The absolute truth of a God who made us and made everything we see. A God who has a way for us to live life to its fullest and desires that for us and loves us so much that despite the fact that we keep messing up over and over and over, he made a way for us to have a relationship with him, a way for us to love him and learn to love others. That's absolute truth. That is the gospel, the good news that Jesus proclaimed. But remember, if there's an absolute truth here, that would mean that on the other side, there's an absolute non-truth or untruth. If there's an absolute right, there's an absolute wrong. And not everybody wants to live in a world of black or whites. It's so much easier to live in a world of grays. It's simpler that way. And that was Pilate. But despite that John tells us then that Pilate went out. He went to the Jews that were hanging around there because they were waiting to see what was going to happen. And he just said, I find no basis for this charge against him. Right? Even though Pilate questioned whether there could be such a thing as truth, he clearly understood when something was a lie. That the accusations against Jesus weren't the truth. But let's be honest, the plot against Jesus, it was never about truth. And so a little later in the story, you may know how this goes. Pilate gives them an option. Hey, I can release Jesus to you this holiday, or I can release to you a murderous insurrectionist. And surprising to him, the crowd chooses Barabbas, the murderer. And Pilate found himself trapped. I mean, he was trapped between truth and keeping order. He was trapped between justice and injustice. And Pilate, quite frankly, lacked the conviction to choose the right direction. In fact, the next part of John chapter 19, the first part is really what Pilate's known for. It's Pilate's legacy. We don't know much else about Pilate after his interactions with Jesus. All we know is that at some point Pilate had another interface, this time with the Samaritans, that didn't go real well. And so Pilate was called back to Rome to stand trial for what happened. But in the midst of those travels, Emperor Tiberius died. And we don't know what happened to Pilate. He kind of disappears from the pages of history, never to be seen again. And so this is his lasting legacy. Not for his Roman rule, not for his place in history in the Roman government, but for the role he played in the mystery at Skull Mountain. That when given the opportunity to stand for something, he figuratively and literally sat down and handed Jesus over to be crucified. In fact, you could say that Pilate's legacy, it's just a footnote. Governor of Judea is a footnote in the much larger story of a king who gave his life for us. So I know we don't normally do this, read long passages all at one time, but I want us to sit with Pilate's legacy for a couple minutes. So if you have your Bibles, I'm going to read just the first part of John chapter 19. As we read the story of Pilate, it'll be up on the screen so you can follow along. Here's what John writes. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him in the face. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." And when Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to him, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." But the Jews insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." And when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. And he went back inside the palace. "Where did you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be king opposes Caesar." And when Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out, sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, "Take him away. Take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. And finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. And that's his legacy. That's what he will be known for. Which brings us back to the question that we started with. What do you want your legacy to be? Right? Not just what you'll be remembered for, what people might say about you. What do you want them to say? Generations from now, what do you want to be your legacy? And you may be here this morning and you're still not real sure who you think this Jesus is. You're still not quite sure that he's the Son of God as he claimed. And the question at some point you're going to have to face is, what do I do with Jesus? What do you do with Jesus? Because to paraphrase C.S. Lewis, Jesus was either a liar and he made all this up, he was a lunatic and just a crazy man, or he is Lord. You have to choose one at some point because the ramifications, if he is Lord, are eternal. And I know it's hard to believe in an absolute truth in a world that tells you there's many paths to it or there's no path to it. But I'm here to tell you there's an absolute truth of a God who loves you. Not only loves you, but made a way by giving his life. That's what we remember this next week. He gave his life to make that way. And so my question to you would be, what are you going to do with Jesus? Maybe this time, maybe this season as we remember and celebrate is the time you take a step in his direction, that you move to acknowledging him as Lord. And you might be in here today and you're like, John, I'm already there. Thank you. Great message, but I already believe in Jesus. I'm a Jesus believer. Thank you. He's already my Lord. And I got to ask you that then the next question is not just do you believe in Jesus, but does your life look like you follow him? Because I think it's great to be a Jesus believer, but I want you to just as much be a Jesus follower. When people remember your life, when they remember your legacy, will they remember that about you? That you not only lived the way that he's called us to live, but that you loved God with all you are and you loved others the way he commanded us to? Is that your legacy? And for all of us, I think the bigger question is, will we be part of God's story? Will our legacy be part of God's story, or will we be a footnote just like Pilate? A minor character in a greater story that we're not really involved in or impacted. Before we close, I got a little bit of a confession to make. That whole part about death and not being scared of death and my funeral and the really goofy pictures, that's all true. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, that's all true. But as far as my legacy or what I want to be known for, I think that's changed over the last 5 or so years. Now, when I was in the corporate world, so before I came here to community, I had lots of people I worked with over those 20 years I consider friends. I had one person in particular I considered my best friend. He, oddly enough, shared the same name as me. We were the exact same age, which is another odd coincidence. And even though we were the same age, the entire 20 years we knew each other, he always looked like he was 25. And even when I was 25, I looked like I was 50. So we were like soul brothers, but he got all the good genes and the full head of hair. And anyways, we cut our teeth together. We grew up in the company together at the lower rungs, and we had each other's back. I don't know about you, you just find that person in life that you connect with. There's someone you just feel a bond with that you can't really explain. And as often happens in life, life gets in the way, right? We grew up, responsibilities got more at work. We were traveling a ton across the world. Our families grew, and we were connecting less and less. And at some point, he decided to leave the corporate world. He bought into a couple franchises, was really successful, and did really well. But I moved to Batesville. I became a pastor. When you're not local and you're also not that crazy work hard, play hard guy you used to be, we just didn't connect. And for about a year, we hadn't talked. And then one afternoon, I got a phone call from a mutual friend of ours. And when I answered, he just said, "I'm so sorry." And he proceeded to tell me how our friend had taken his life the night before. And I was shocked, of course, hadn't connected with him in a while, and then proceeded to tell me how the last year or two had been really hard, how he had gone through depression and anxiety, how he kind of lost his sense of direction, sense of who he was. And so I drove up to the funeral that next week, drove up to Cleveland, and I'm at the funeral, and people are in the visitation line, and I just kind of sat there. I sat there in maybe the second or third row and just looked at the coffin. Looked at his body. He had this smiling picture of himself next to it. And I just remember looking back and forth and trying to rationalize how he got from here to there. All the good times that we had, all the fun times and crazy times, but the heart-to-hearts, the really serious times. And I couldn't fathom how could he go from being the smart, fun, good-looking, energetic guy to being in that coffin. I couldn't fathom how he trudged through struggles and depression and anxiety to get to that point. And at the same time, I was juxtaposing that with my life at that point, because we had been on the same path, but here I was with a new direction God had given me and a new hope and peace that I hadn't had before. And so I got in the car and I drove back to Batesville. And as I drove, I just felt that burden for the lost. Maybe for the first time, knowing that funerals like that break God's heart too. And so I committed at that time that I would try really hard, and I'm not all the way there yet, but I want my legacy to be someone who pointed people in the direction of Jesus. Not to waste the intersections I have with people in life and the opportunities to introduce him to them. Not just from what we say, right, because saying stuff's real easy, but from how I treat them, how I model that in my own life. And so that's what I hope my legacy is. And I'd ask you again, what do you want your legacy to be? What do you hope to be remembered for? What part will you play in God's story? Let's pray. Dear Lord, I thank you for this portion recorded for us in that last week of your life, the last days of your life. I thank you for the lesson we have in the person of Pilate, and someone with so much opportunity, sitting face to face with the King of Kings and not recognizing truth when he sees it. And so as we reflect this next week on the sacrifice you made for us, as we reflect on death, our impending death at some point, and as we celebrate your resurrection next week, it's a great time to ask ourselves, how are we doing? What will we be known for? What is our legacy in the face of your legacy, in the face of Pilate, a footnote in your greater story? For the person in this room who has come face to face with you before and still hasn't made up their mind, may this be a season that they can move in your direction. For those of us that have declared you Lord, may this be a season where we challenge ourselves to really understand, are we following how you want us to follow? Are we leading people to you? May our legacy be one that brings you honor and glory. Amen.